Good afternoon. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, Tenant Responses to the Eviction Crisis, a roundtable discussion. I'm Steve Dubb, and I'm Senior Editor and Director of the Economic Justice Program here at Nonprofit Quarterly. This is our second Housing Justice webinar that we're doing in partnership with Shelterforce. A number of folks who attended our webinar in July requested a follow-up. To be honest, we actually hoped maybe it wouldn't be needed, but it is. So we are here and we are very grateful to have you here with us. For today's discussion, we are joined by three amazing panelists. Miriam Axel-Lute is based in Albany, New York, and is editor of Shelterforce, which has covered housing and community development issues for over 40 years. Koya Crespin is a tenant organizer for the Community Alliance of Tenants and is based in Portland, Oregon, and they work statewide. Maya Neal is a tenant organizer with KC Tenants based in Kansas City, Missouri. A few notes before we get started. First, we're very excited to take your questions. Other than this opening slide and a closing slide, there are no slides for this webinar. I will be posing some questions drawn largely from questions that many of you asked at our earlier webinar in July, and then we'll respond to the questions you have today. Please enter your questions in the question box at the bottom of your screen, and I will share as many of them as I can with the panelists. Second, we will be sharing the recording by email after the webinar, so please don't ask, will I get a recording? You will get a recording, and we should have it to you most likely within 48 hours, if not sooner. One last thing, this webinar is free, but producing these webinars is not. So if you like what we are doing and can support MPQ's economic justice work, please consider making a donation today. You can also join the conversation via social media. We have the hashtag Rebuild the Economy. Thanks so much for joining us, and also please complete the survey at the end of the webinar because it does inform our future work. And with that, let's begin by Maya. Can you talk about the situation on the ground right now in Kansas City as it concerns housing?
Yes, thanks, Steve. So the question is, what is the situation on the ground in Kansas City? I would just like to say first and foremost, hi everyone, I'm very excited to be here. My name is Maya Neal and I'm a leader with KC Tenants. I am from Kansas City and I have deep personal experience with housing insecurity and housing injustice. So I've been building power in KC Tenants since July of last year. As we know, it's the first of the month. September 1st is here and rent is due again. 248,000 renters across households in Missouri are currently at risk for eviction. In March, we won an eviction moratorium for our county, only until presiding judge David M. Byrne allowed it to expire in May. Since then, landlords have evicted thousands of KC tenants in person and by teleconference. By teleconference. Tenants are being evicted by teleconference, so you either have the risk of exposing yourself to COVID in person or having your due process violated. What this process looks like for us now, on July 30th, KC Tenants staged a disruption which took place in in-person eviction dockets as well as over-the-phone eviction hearings. In Kansas City, eviction hearings happen every Thursday. For context. KC Tenants leaders were prompted with the script, no one should be evicted during a global pandemic. All evictions are an act of violence. This is not justice. This is not due process. Everyone deserves a place to live. And tenants in the room, this is not your fault. You are not alone. This was an unprecedented action, and our disruption resulted in the halting of all evictions held that week, aka we shut it down. So what's next for KC Tenants? Since the government is not taking the responsibility to cancel rent, we KC Tenants are taking it upon ourselves to care for our people. in acts of unprecedented solidarity, including eviction defense. KC Tenants is continuing to organize, led by people who are the most impacted by the crisis at every step of the way. We are planning much larger eviction defense strategy that'll launch soon. Thanks, everyone.
Koya, sorry, I was on mute. Could you talk about Portland and the situation there and within the state of Oregon broadly?
For sure. I wanted to start off and say thank you, Maya. That was really inspiring to hear all the work y'all are doing. So excited to be on this call today. I'm Koya Crespin. My pronouns are she, her. I sit on occupied Chinookan land in Portland, Oregon. And our situation is a little bit different. We have some legislation in place right now that's protecting tenants to a certain degree, as well as property owners. We have an eviction moratorium in place that was extended throughout September 30th. So what it does is it prevents the no-cause evictions and evictions issued based on late rent being filed during this time. It's also unlawful for landlords to award late rent penalties during this moment in time too. Just recently, on Monday, gosh, it's Tuesday, Kate Brown issued another executive order extending the foreclosure moratorium throughout the end of the year, citing coronavirus recession for folks. There was little mention, however, of an extension of renters protections. There was a little mention of it. So tenant leaders in Oregon are asking for bold leadership, not just we don't want to be handed crumbs. We don't want to, we want more robust and idealistic policy enactments during this time of national pandemic. I myself am a tenant. I've always been a tenant, and I am working right now, and I work really hard, and I'm behind on my rent, and so it's stacking up as it goes. You know, I'm choosing to use money for, like many tenants across the state, I'm opting to use the money for food for my kids, my 3 adorable children who eat a lot of food, and forego on rent and let it stack up. And so I'm in the place of many tenants all across Oregon. I wanted to also lift up, there's a fair amount of tension due across the nation, which I'm sure Maya, y'all are dealing with as well, due to uprising and racist factions. In Oregon, we are a little different, being as we were the first whites only state and formed as a white utopia. And there's a long history of racism here in this state. And tenants are out there fighting for a plethora of intersectional issues.
Great, thanks, Koya. Maya, you know, is canceling rent the only viable option to protect people from eviction? What are the tools that are available?
Yes, Steve, canceling rent is the only viable option to truly protect renters. Canceling rent is not only the right thing to do, it's also the smartest, least exhausting, and the most just option for renters. It is a critical intervention in the current market that subjects renters to horrendously inflated rent prices. Housing is a human right. It should be a public good. It should not be commodified. If the prescription for COVID is staying in your home and the prescription for COVID is protecting your community, what does that mean for those of us who now can't stay in our homes, who never could, and who were homeless to begin with? Thanks.
Great. Koya, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just I spoke earlier about extensions of eviction and foreclosure moratoriums. And these types of legislations are not sustainable, and they're kicking the can down that proverbial road that we're talking about, right? Cancel the rent is a real policy solution. We need to, as we do the work to ensure that it's a universal, comprehensive solution that's prioritized for all of the insecure renters across the state and doesn't prioritize the profits of corporate landlords and banks who have already, frankly, been bailed out by the federal government. And then backing up a bit regarding the extension of Oregon's foreclosure moratorium for property owners versus the eviction moratorium for renters. Property owners are able to tack what they owe on to the back end of their loan, giving them years to repay what they owe, whereas tenants are given 6 months under Oregon's current repayment period to pay back. To which I would say to electeds, make it make sense somehow.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And that's a good lead in to you, Miriam. You know, how can tenants get the relief they need and while enabling landlords, for example, to stay current on their mortgages?
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. I'm Miriam Axelute. My pronouns are she, her. I'm up here in upstate New York on Haudenosaunee land. I edit Shelterforce, which we've been, as Steve said, covering housing and community development topics for 40 years. And we send out a newsletter every week if you want to hear what read what we're doing. In terms of the overall housing system, I think Coy already mentioned mortgage forbearance, which is the key thing. It's the first step for making sure that we keep tenants in their homes, that the main concern is that these buildings don't get snapped up by institutional investors and big Wall Street landlords, as happened in 2008. Mortgage forbearance is the first step. Mortgage forbearance should come with conditions like not pursuing your tenants for rent and things like that. And the payments should be tacked on the end, not a balloon payment like when an eviction moratorium ends. That is not necessarily a given for mortgage forbearance, but that's how it should be going in the current situation. Then we have to deal with the fact that there are other costs for providing housing that are beyond mortgage and profit. There's utilities, property taxes, repairs and maintenance, and we need to pay attention to those things and figure out how we make sure that a responsible housing provider is able to take care of those, while those that are those that are getting windfall profits are sacrificing some of those profits to make sure that everybody can stay in their homes. I think the key thing here is that there's going to need to be resources put into the system in some way. We need resources to come, and Congress is dragging their feet about doing anything about it. Some states are trying to do something about it. There's about 15 of them that have some rent relief, but they can't do it by themselves. Only the federal government can provide enough resources to make this all balance out. And the most important thing right now is that to make those resources come, there needs to be a crisis. And we have two choices. The crisis can be we're breaking the system and making sure that evictions don't happen, or the crisis can be evictions happen and there's a huge surge in homelessness. And the second one of those is not acceptable. So the first one is what we have to do, everything possible to make sure that people can stay in their homes until we can force the resources to come through to make a more just housing system balance out.
Great, thanks, Miriam. Maya, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
I do. I just want to say first and foremost that I think this question is bogus. The order of operations, I believe, should be cancel rent and then cancel mortgage.
That was my suggestion. Sorry.
The relationship between landlords and tenants. So What is a landlord? What is a tenant? Being a landlord and having access to additional property is a very different position and a very powerful position. So let's look at what's at stake for each party. The worst case scenario for a landlord is profit loss and having to reformulate their business. The worst case scenario for a tenant is losing their home, being forced into the streets, and potentially putting their life at risk in this time of coronavirus. People can and have died from evictions. The stakes are not the same, and frankly, I don't have a lot of sympathy for landlords who pretend like the stakes are the same. Landlords are a business. They've assumed the risk of running a business. They are not entitled to their profit. Let's look at who's gotten relief. All the existing relief is currently in the benefit of the landlords. All of the protections are in favor of the property owners, from PPP loans to mortgage forbearance options. Tenants have not benefited at all. Like what we have been demanding, we've finally been demanding a rent and mortgage cancellation. We've had property owners throw down with us. I think that's all I have to say on that.
That's great. This sort of leads to the next question I had, which was, can this crisis lead to a better system? Things like resident-owned community housing. Do you see a chance for that? Where the tenants basically are also the landlords.
Koya, I think you're slated for this one first.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
Sure, yeah. I think it was Miriam who mentioned, 2008 and the choices that happened then, allowing tens of thousands of families to be evicted with no social safety net, banks and private equity firms buying up swaths of housing, or taking care of the families who were rocked by the bubble, popping and moving toward actually stabilizing the economy at a ground level. And so I think this time we don't have to make the same mistakes again, and we can't afford to make the same mistakes again. And our government continues to sacrifice renters and small homeowners across the country. So I guess I say that to say that, yes, it can absolutely lead us to a more just housing system. That's going to require a lot of political will on all sides. And commitment to not repeat those failures of 2008. So.
Fair enough. Thanks. Maya, did you want to jump in at all here?
Yeah, thanks, Koya. Thanks, Steve. What I would say is, yes, this can absolutely lead to a better system. The only answer is rent and mortgage cancellation. We should use every opportunity that we have available to us to organize for the world that we need and that we want to see happen. This pandemic illuminates the absolute brokenness of our current system, and we treat housing as a commodity. In this crisis, now we have the opportunity to create a world where we win a homes guarantee and finally, at long last, affirm our commitment to the richest country in the world, to guaranteeing that everyone has a home, period. Everyone has a home.
Great, thanks. There's some folks, go ahead.
Steve, can I address that one?
Yeah, please.
So taking what Maya and Koya said as the beginning of this, because absolutely, there's going to be landlords that get rid of their property in this scenario, whether because we canceled the rent and they don't want to deal, or because some property value is changing, whatever it is. And we need to be prepared to get control of those properties. And there's many ways, and there's a lot of tools out there that can bring those properties out of the speculative market and into public ownership or community ownership or tenant ownership. We're about to publish an article that goes into some of this in more depth, but there's a number of things out there that we learned from 2008 about how to do this. There's the National Community Stabilization Trust, which is an entity that allows nonprofits and others to get access to properties. The most important thing is we need to keep the all cash institutional buyers from being able to come in and scoop up those properties before anyone else is able to get access to them. And so NCST allows nonprofits to have the first chance before those buyers get a chance to buy. Land banks can also have standards for who can buy their properties, which can keep out the worst actors. Sometimes there can be standards that when entities are selling off packages of distressed mortgages even before foreclosures have happened, that nonprofits who are going to help homeowners stay in their homes and help get those other properties into affordable housing have the first access to it. And there's tenant right to purchase laws that are being, bills that are being proposed in many places around the country as well. So all of these kinds of things that make sure that we give priority to the people who we want to have access to this housing as opposed to Wall Street are all crucial. And then the broken record, there needs to be resources to back that up. So we need to put resources into this, and that those resources need to be quick and flexible and not take months and months and months to access. So the nonprofits, the tenant groups, the co-ops, the land trusts, they all need to have access to the funds they need to get those buildings, maintain those buildings, and set up the kind of permanently affordable housing, community controlled housing that we need.
Great. Miriam, I wanted to follow up with a question for the audience because I think it's relevant, and it's really about the nonprofit housing providers, right? So obviously nonprofits actually collect rent from a number of renters, and what's their situation with all this?
So far, they've been not doing as badly as they feared in the beginning. Most, if not all, nonprofit housers are not pursuing evictions during a pandemic or anything. They're working with their tenants to make sure they can stay in place, have what they need. They're drawing on their reserves. They're refinancing their mortgages. They're looking to various things to make sure that they can keep providing the housing that they're providing. But they're nervous, certainly. And if as unemployment insurance ends and other things, these entities, if they go into foreclosure themselves, the income restrictions and the affordability on those properties disappears, and that's not good for anybody. So they're in an interesting in-between place where their commitment is to their tenants and they're going to do what they need to do for that, but they can't do it without help at some point if the rent is not available.
Right. It gets back to the point Maya was making about having an actual right to housing, right? So I wanted to, one point that gets raised, and this was a question that came up in our webinar in July, was, well, it's a weak market, meaning that if a lot of people are being thrown out of housing, then there's nobody to, if tenants are behind on rent, there's nobody to demand the housing, so that the incentive for the landlord is theoretically to keep the person in the housing, as opposed to evicting. Why do you see evictions even when the market is soft, even when there isn't a whole lot of demand of people who have cash to to pay for rent for housing?
Can you clarify that question?
Yeah. So what motivates a eviction in a weak market, right? That's really the question, when, there's not a ready alternative to fill that spot. Koya, you want to go for that first?
Sure. Maya mentioned earlier, landlording is a business, right? Landlords are able to collect fees for every tenant that they turn over. They're able to collect, hold deposits. And in Oregon, they're never even liable to really, unless you press a landlord and you continue to press them, landlords don't have to fix what they said that they were going to fix as they withhold your deposit. They can just continue on as business as usual, right? So I think there's a fair amount of that going on. I also just want to flag too, like currently I'm speaking with tenant families. A lot of folks are families of color or multiple children who are being given violation notices during the time of pandemic, simply for having like their children's things outside. And also with the knowledge that now our homes are classrooms, right? So families are spending time in their home a lot. To be receiving violation notices feels like families are being pushed out for professionals who are coming in and looking at the same units. And so this is just precipitating gentrification and just continuing on the same path that's been going on for decades.
Yeah, thanks. Maya, anything you want to add?
Of course, Koya. And so the question again is, what motivates evictions in a weak market?
Correct.
Evictions have nothing to do with the market. Evictions are about power and control. So let's examine the relationship between tenants and landlords as they exist now. Who has the power? Landlords. Who is subjected to the good faith of landlords to not get evicted? Tenants. Landlords don't have to evict people. I think that this question clearly shows that you don't understand power. Landlords will leverage any and all power they have to dehumanize folks, oftentimes at additional cost of court fees to them, or having business models that profit from providing housing to vulnerable tenants in need.
Right, thanks. You know, speaking of eviction, what is, how would you advise people who, I mean, this is a lot of your organizing work, you know, how do you advise folks who face the threat of eviction in coming weeks and months, as, you know, a lot of protections have, I mean, there's still protections in Oregon, but a lot of places are unprotected. Koya, you know, how are folks in Missouri responding? I'm sorry, you're in Oregon. How are folks in Oregon responding in terms of, and what do you advise tenants in order to protect themselves from eviction and keep themselves in the home?
Yeah, so we're kind of taking things at Community Alliance of Tenants in a two-pronged attempt, right? You're working for legislation, but with the knowledge that legislation is not the be-all, end-all answer, and people power is what's going to really move forward our movement that folks on the call are speaking about earlier, decommodifying housing and making sure that housing is a human right, and how can we utilize this moment to take land back, also with the knowledge and with the lens. When we're talking about land, we're talking about Indigenous folks fighting for sovereignty. We're talking about houseless folks who have been inherently criminalized for occupying space, right? And how are we as a tenant-led movement in Oregon recognizing those pieces of the past to help move us forward? Excuse me. I swallowed something down a weird tube right now. So now is really the time for organizing. I think we've seen and heard a lot about intersectional work, and I think we're going to speak a little bit later about how housing is healthcare and how we're framing things for folks. Yeah, it's a powerful reframing in the moment. You know, I say this all the time to my children, to myself in the mirror, to tenant leaders, no one's gonna come save us. No one's gonna, once we get put out, that's it, you know? Like, and we're in a space of really a lot of vulnerability and being scared as a whole, as tenants. And when we rise up together and take care of each other together and occupy space together, what does that really look like?
Great, thanks. Maya, anything you want to add on this?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Koya. That was like really grounding. The question was, what would be the best advice to give anyone facing the threat of eviction in the coming weeks and months, and how can tenants safely approach landlords? I believe that there is no safety due to the power dynamics that I discussed earlier. Landlords will and do have the right to evict you. So, like in this moment and moving forward, I suggest recording all interactions you have with your landlord, trying to find a lawyer or a housing advocate, use resistant tactics, form a tenant union, and organize. Like, we need to organize because collectively we are more powerful than we are as individuals. We have to find others who are in similar struggles and build power together. If we do not see the solutions we need, we will have to shut it down together. I also want to take this moment to share Casey Tenants, we have developed an organizing toolkit in the form of a zine that can help you unionize your building. So I'm going to drop that link to everyone in the chat. And Koya, we should connect after this.
Thanks, that's great, thanks. So, you know, Maya, in terms of advocacy. I mean, a lot of, is there a common message that you find when you're promoting tenants' rights in Kansas City or in Missouri? That are there messages that are effective? What works in terms of advocacy?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So I am of the belief that we must always constantly combat the dominant narrative of housing insecurity being the fault of the individual versus what we know to be true, which is evictions are an act of violence done upon us by landlords. Housing is a basic human right, and everyone deserves safe, accessible, and truly affordable housing. Everyone deserves a home. When working with elected officials, it's important that we always center people. People tell their stories. People shape their own testimonies. That matters, and I believe that it helps humanize the numbers and policies and ideas that follow. We should try to figure out the elected officials' own self-interest in our work. We should ask them relational questions about their connection to our struggle. One second. Also, no, hold on.
That's,
Yeah.
I'll go, thanks. I'll go to Koya. Koya, what do you find works in advocacy? Anything you want to add from your experience?
Yeah, that was a lot of great information from Maya. I hope y'all was taking notes, because that was a step-by-step. I feel like also knowing who your quote-unquote target is, or who you want to impress upon your story to, and always lifting up your tenant leaders' stories, because tenant leaders are they're the expert of their own existence, and you can throw data and statistics at electeds all day, but folks are really going to remember like a 10-year-old girl advocating for her whole building not to get evicted in a mass eviction. And that little girl was my daughter, and she was invited to Senate floor by Lou Frederick as an advocate of housing. And she was like 7 at that point. And you remembered that girl who was being put out of her apartment with all of her neighbors as a symbol of something that should never, ever happen. You know what I mean? And so always lifting up stories of your folks is the strongest advocacy tool you could ever have. And just kind of going back to the point of canceling the rent. Like, yes, some people might call it canceling the rent. Other people might call it housing stability. Whatever we call it, the intention is the same. And sometimes when you call something one thing versus another, it can scare certain factors of electeds. So just keeping that in mind whenever you're talking to somebody is helpful just in my work.
Yeah, I just remembered my train of thought on that. So like, that's absolutely right. Like, sometimes none of this works in the way the world is like currently. So you should always be working to build your own power to, like, in the event that elected officials don't understand this concept, or it just is like outside of them, I believe that you should build enough power to take over the elected officials, like poor and working class folks, tenants, people of color should be the people in the formal positions of power. Like, we can and will replace it. If we don't get it, shut it down.
Great, thanks. So I did want to follow up, and talking about housing is health and health is housing. And Koya, I know you had some thoughts about that. Uh-oh. Did we lose Koya?
You turned off your video instead of on your mic, Koya, I think.
Why don't I ask?
I can say my piece on that, and we can go back to Koya, because I want to hear what she has to say too. But I just wanted to say that I think the pandemic has been a perfect moment to hold up the fact that when those hospitals and health funders and other folks in the health sector who have been starting to realize that stable housing is healthcare, is essential for health, that we need to ask them to take a stand on housing policy, both adequate funding and tenant rights. So it's been really great and very wonderful that various healthcare sectors have started to finance affordable housing construction and transitional housing and things like that. And that's really important and wonderful, but it's also really important that they use their voice and the respect that their organizations have to advocate for policies like just cause eviction moratoriums, things like that. And it has happened in some places. In 2017, there were doctors who stepped up and testified in support of just cause eviction in Boston. We have an article coming up about how some hospitals that are part of the healthcare anchor network lobbied for housing funding at the national level pre-pandemic. So having those folks in the room who often carry respect are not who people are expecting to be out there talking about just cause eviction or rent relief or things can help shift the balance toward the policies that we need. So policy advocacy, not just financing construction, is the step that we need to ask them to take.
Great, thanks. Koya, you're back. So do you want to talk about this intersection?
I'm back. My fault, y'all. Yeah, I mean, definitely the framing of housing being healthcare is something that is very powerful. COVID-19 has definitely heightened what we already know, that people experiencing houselessness face greater health risks in general, mortality rate 4 to 9 times higher than those in stable housing. And this is predominantly due to chronic illness, right? And violence faced on the street, BIPOC folks being inherently more at risk. Let's talk about reshaping hospitals and talk about, or reshaping the framework, hospitals being safety net institutions. Hospital workers see firsthand patients who don't have stable homes, struggling with the need as we shelter in place after being treated and released from the hospital. And, you know, now is the time. If there ever was a time, now is the time to explore and disrupt the root causes of houselessness, including stagnant wages, lack of healthcare, mental and behavioral health services, over policing, and unaffordable housing. And how do all these issues really intersect?
Yeah, great. And I think that leads to our next question, which is really, you know, folks who may not like live and breathe affordable housing, but, you know, this is something that affects everybody, right? Tenants especially. You know, how, like the example of the hospitals or health conversion foundations, what can people do, what, you know, whatever sector they're in the economy, that can actually, you know, make a difference in the current period? And I don't have an order for this, but who wants to jump in? Okay, I'll call on Maya to start.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so what can we do nationally, locally to support housing justice? I believe that it is within everyone's self-interest right now to show up in this movement. Anyone can donate, anyone can get plugged in and have some sort of role to play in direct actions in this whole crisis at large that we are living in. And that can be all the way from providing emotional support and labor to writing big checks like, where's the money? Drop in the KC Tenant donate link in the chat. So.
Yeah, and clearly there are people who are profiteering off of this crisis. I just saw a recent article that said that this guy out in Washington State, what's his name? Oh yeah, Jeff Bezos, right? You know, he has a $200 billion net worth now. Huh. It's gone up by 75 billion in this year. But Koya, anything you want to add?
Oh, I wasn't done.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say thank you for facilitating this like interesting and amazing conversation like this.
We still have 20 minutes of questions from the audience, so we're not quite done yet, but thank you. Koya.
Mike said it real well. We accept checks too. I'm about to drop a website into the chat, of course. And as far as just being many ways to plug in, at Community Alliance of Tenants, we have a couple of different like membership options, so folks can be working members. We don't ask for money for folks as dues, and we do our best to support folks via food boxes, check stipends if we can, helping folks out with direct links to legal aid. But the community that you can form when you decide to just go knock on your neighbor's door and see if they're facing the same issues that you're facing is invaluable. And you don't have to be a tenant to go knock on your neighbor's door and see what they're going through. You know, I think we're noticing now in this time, community is so much more vital, and we're supporting each other in these ways that are that our government refuses to, right? And there's something very beautiful in that. So I would tell folks who are traditionally not organizers or not into housing, like, you really are an organizer. You just haven't acknowledged it in yourself, because I'm sure there was a time when you organized a party for your child, or you said, hey, everybody, let's get a meal train for Suzanne who's sick at the house. You know what I'm saying? You're an organizer. We're all organizers. So get up and organize.
Great, thanks. Miriam, so I'll let you jump in here too. And, there are a couple of questions from the audience that sort of relate to this. Like there was somebody asking, what can an arts nonprofit do on housing justice? There was a question about collective impacting. Do you find, government and nonprofits and tenants and landlords actually finding solutions together in any communities? So since you cover a broad gambit, I thought I'd throw that at you and see if you had any thoughts.
Well, I have some thoughts. I wanted to say, I think Maya and Koya gave a really powerful call to us as individuals. And then some people also have roles within institutions. And some of those institutions aren't grant-giving institutions, but sort of like I said with the hospitals, you have weight. You can, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel and become a housing expert. You can follow the existing organizations that are out there. There's the Right to the City Network, there's the People's Action Network, there's the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and others. And if you follow a couple of these, you will find sign-on letters, you will find other things that you can lend your institutional support to, and that can be meaningful, again, because you're bringing in unexpected voices to call for these things. And I just want to remind you all who are in 501c3 organizations that you are actually allowed to lobby. You can't endorse candidates, but you can lobby for things. It just has to be a small portion of what you do. But putting your organization's name on a sign-on letter or reaching out to a local housing organization and seeing if there's a small way that you can support them is not going to tip that over. So, check with the legal stuff, but don't hold back from taking a stand on this because you're a 501c3. Just that's what I would say. And reach out to some organizations. There was a mention of the arts nonprofit. Arts and culture is how we change the narrative. That's how we change the idea of what's possible. We need that help to change the idea of housing from a commodity to housing as a basic human need. And so participating with housers in thinking of ways to help shift that narrative is one thing that all arts organizations can help with.
Great, thanks. So this kind of follows in a way, like in terms of rethinking about the, housing is not a commodity. So there was this idea back in the 30s and 40s called public housing. It still exists. It's been delegitimized in a lot of ways. could a reconceptualized public housing actually, or what's sometimes called social housing up in Canada, for example, actually play a productive role in ensuring that people have the housing that they need?
I think absolutely. I think we need a stronger public housing system. I think we need a public housing system that we haven't disinvested from for decades and decades. We need a public housing system that is more of a public option for housing, like we have spoken about a public option for healthcare. And when you do that, when you don't, when it's not under constant assault for decades, it can be an extremely viable way to provide housing all across Europe. There's examples of successful social housing, and there's no reason beyond our cultural issues in the US that we couldn't do it here better than we have.
Great, thanks. Anything you want, Maya or Koya, you want to add on public housing? Have you thought about it? Koya? Yeah.
I like, just as Miriam mentioned, just like the kind of the reframing of public housing and or social housing, being like compensating landlords as buyouts, not bailouts, buying out homes, transferring properties with delinquent mortgages, but more so just the ability to enact stronger eminent domain that might be a means of implementing these types of buyouts while providing landlords who, may or may not be distressed, compensation and a way to create real community control. We're working at CAT on a tenant opportunity to purchase policy. And this is a great way to reframe what community housing can really look like. When you create sustainable programmatics for folks to understand what economic viability really is. And as I mentioned before, it's time for tenants to be seen for the viable folks we are in this economy.
Great. So this question, I think I'm going to throw at Maya first, although anyone can jump in, but I thought it was, how can we build a better public narrative around evictions as state violence? Is there a framing that can help people understand the actual, physical and psychological harm that evictions do?
Yeah, excellent question. Such as we combat our city officials with we combat the dominant narrative when talking about housing as a basic human right. When we want to center the violence of evictions, I believe that it should always be done through lived experiences of those closest to the problem. And KC Tenants, we believe those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So when it comes, as Koya said, from a human with a face, when it's personable, when it's relatable, there is no greater way to, I believe, state the message that, hi, this was violent and this happened to me. One of, actually I won't give an example. While I have never had an eviction, I have been displaced twice in 3 months from the property that I last rented from. And this had a horrible, astounding impact on my ability to regain social traction. I still, at the same time, I was experiencing discrimination at work, so I signed an NDA basically to not sue X company. And with these intersectionalities, I was homeless, or I was displaced, I was without a home, I was jobless in the course of 2 weeks, and that's violent. That's violent. It's not an eviction, it's different. But things like that, let's hear from the people who have been evicted how violent evictions are to them.
Yeah, thanks. So there were a couple questions that came in from folks about undocumented folks, undocumented immigrants, and you know, in your tenant organizing, how do you you know, work with this? I mean, either Koya or Maya, whoever wants to jump in. You know, I imagine you do come across tenants who don't have papers and so forth. How does that affect tenant organizing? How do you work with that?
So inherently in organizing, you are always listening more than you're talking, right? So when somebody's telling you their fears and telling you what they think might be barriers, those are real fears and real barriers to their own organizing. And so just acknowledging folks' fears and making sure people know that, and you know yourself that you have capacity for this. Because if you don't have capacity to offer that support to folks who have status issues, you need to find somebody who does have that capacity and support to offer to folks. I was organizing in my building full of folks with status issues. As I said, we all got evicted together. Folks were not backing down. Status issues are not. And they felt protected in a circle of each other. Some folks had different status issues, some folks didn't. But we were in a circle together. So when you're really supported by community members, there's a different type of feeling. One of my most outspoken tenant leaders potentially have status issues, you know?
Yeah, thanks.
You have community around folks.
Maya, do you work with folks who are in that situation too?
Can I have the question again?
Well, it's about undocumented workers and how do you ensure that, you know, how do you protect people who are undocumented from, you know, losing their housing? I mean, they have, of course, the least resources and the least protection in many ways.
If we're going to use the model, people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. The people who experience status issues should be the one to determine what their needs are. And it is our job as organizers to organize alongside of them in solidarity to create those conditions for them.
Great, thanks.
I just want to note quickly that that is one of the reasons that arguing for canceling rent and then providing whatever support is needed in another way. People argue for that rather than rent relief programs that individual tenants have to qualify for, because those individual eligibility then often rules out undocumented folks and a number of other folks. So
yeah, this was such a full webinar, we didn't even touch on means testing, which
I wanted to hear what you had to say about means testing.
Let's talk about means testing, please. Yeah, go for it.
And means testing has been shown not to really gain the effect that is needed, but it's really a runaround for folks with status issues, low-income folks. Means testing is a barrier rather than what the intention would be to find out. Let's help the folks who really need it the most, and it inherently blocks out folks who really need the help the most. I think that's why the policy of housing stability bills or canceling the rent bills are the most cohesive because of the universal access points.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen the challenge of trying to, in an emergency situation of the pandemic, trying to do means testing. It's been pretty disastrous in a lot of different areas, such as PPP. You know, there's a couple of questions about federal policies, like, and Miriam, this might be you, although anyone could jump in. You know, are there examples of innovative ways of using community development block grants, for example, that are worth lifting up to this audience, you know, in the current situation?
I don't know exactly how innovative it is, but people should know that that community development block grants can be used for rent relief right now, and many places are doing that. It's not enough. It has some of the issues that, depending on how you set up the fund that Koya was just talking about, but that is a source of funds that we can use as stopgap measure to help at least some people out right now. And there's a range of different ways that people are applying it. We have an article just up today or yesterday about the ways that various states are using some of the CARES Act funds to try to keep their renters afloat. So you can check out different varieties of that there.
Great. So this is an interesting question. And of course, Miriam and I both work at technically news media outlets, but could how does the media get housing issues wrong, and what are the stories that should be told about housing? So anyone who wants to jump in on that.
The media will sometimes do things where they only get one person's frame, i.e. a landlord. So it would be super helpful if media would reach out to all parties involved. And also it would be really, really helpful if media would make sure that they might be prepared to deal with folks who don't speak English as their first language, or be able to help folks really understand what's going on, or reach out to a tenants organization locally like KC Tenants or CAT to help prep those tenants, because oftentimes when tenants are going through things that the media want to talk to them about, tenants are going through some really scary trauma. And so it's kind of exploitative for a media outlet to reach out to a tenant and try to do an interview about their housing situation they're going through right in that moment. And it would behoove a media outlet to get a hold of a tenant organization that I had mentioned earlier to get a much more robust and fair human interest story.
Great, thanks. All right, well, we have come to the hour, so I want to wrap this up. I know we didn't get to all of your questions, but we got to many of them. So, and there's one of the questions was whether there'd be a third housing webinar, and I think my answer is the same. Like we would hope not, but quite possibly yes, depending on how things develop. We think it's important to make sure that housing issues don't get ignored in this pandemic, and sometimes in the mainstream media it seems to be often missing. So I want to thank Koya Crispin from Community Alliance of Tenants in Oregon, Maya Neal from KC Tenants in Kansas City, Missouri, Miriam Axel-Lute from Shelterforce. Thanks so much to all of you for your questions, and stay tuned for more from both Nonprofit Quarterly and Shelterforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you all. Shout outs, Koya. We should connect.
Yes.
Thank you guys. Great to be on a panel with you.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing this.